We will begin our look at the heart today. We've already started the cardiovascular system or circulatory system, so just before we get into the heart itself, we're going to review quickly the function of the system as well as the different parts of the system. So the cardiovascular system or circulatory system is essentially a transportation system. It's a way that your body is able to get oxygen and nutrients to the cells of your body and get waste materials from your metabolism, or you're using your food to make energy, as well as carbon dioxide, carried away from the cells of your body. It's also going to carry substances that we call hormones, which control different things happening in your body, as well as carrying antibodies, which help to fight off infection. The three parts that the cardiovascular system can be broken into include the heart, blood, and your blood vessels. Now, we've already talked about the blood and blood vessels, so we'll be going into the heart today. With the cardiovascular system being a transportation system, it is going to function in different types of circulation to get blood either specifically to your lungs in the case of pulmonary circulation, or to the systems of your body in the case of systemic circulation. Now, we'll go through the differences between them as we go on in the notes. However, I just want to point out before we do go on that we've talked before about you not having red blood and blue blood, that all of your blood is red. It's just either bright red if it's oxygen rich or dark red if it's oxygen poor. However, when we have diagrams, we use red and blue, so it's easier to tell them apart, because sometimes red and dark red would look too similar on a diagram and it would get mixed up too easily. So as we see here, you have red representing oxygen-rich blood or oxygenated blood that would be coming from your lungs back to the left side of your heart. And then we have blue on the diagram that's representing oxygen-poor blood or deoxygenated blood that's going to be coming back from your body to the right side of your heart to be pumped to your lungs. Okay, and we'll go through all of that again, but you can see here how your heart works kind of in two separate pumps. Okay, so if we look at that, we say that the heart, because of it acts as two separate pumps, we call it a double pump. What that means is that the right side of your heart pumps blood to your lungs, and the left side of your heart pumps blood to your body. If we were to look at the blood inside the right side of your heart, it would be dark red because it's low in oxygen, or we call it oxygen poor blood or deoxygenated blood. That blood that comes into the right side of your heart gets pumped to your lungs, and it's going to travel through your lung, or to your lungs, through the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries carry blood from the right side of the heart to your lungs, and then what it's going to allow to happen there is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide happens. That blood becomes bright red then, and that blood from the lungs comes through the pulmonary veins back to the left side of the heart, and then from there it gets pumped out into the body. If we take a look here, okay, so if we're looking, this will be representing a normal heart. We do have the right side of your heart and the left side of your heart. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you're looking at a heart in anatomical position. So right and left for us is switched on here. So the right side of the diagram that we're looking at is actually the left side of the heart. The right side of the heart is on the left side of the diagram. Okay. We're seeing all these abbreviations for different parts of the heart. We haven't gone over those yet, but we will. So I'm going to just skip those for right this second until we are finished talking about the kinds of circulation. But you can see oxygen-rich blood on the left side of the heart and oxygen-poor blood on the right side of the heart. With those three types of circulation, we've got pulmonary circulation, coronary circulation, and systemic circulation. So your heart is responsible for controlling all of these, okay? So pulmonary, whenever you see the word pulmonary or the prefix pulmo, it's referring to your lungs. So pulmonary circulation is going to get blood pumped from the right side of the heart to your lungs, and then it's going to return back to the left side of your heart. So what that does, what pulmonary circulation allows, is for your blood to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide in your lungs. Next, we have coronary circulation, and that is going to be circulation of blood to the heart itself. So even though, and it's kind of weird to think about, but even though your heart has blood inside of it that it's pumping, the blood inside the heart doesn't actually nourish the heart tissue itself. So the heart needs its own blood vessels. And the first place that your heart pumps blood to when it's leaving the left side of your heart with oxygen in it is going to be to the heart itself. And that is so that your heart can continue to beat and to pump blood to the rest of your heart itself, or from your heart to the rest of the body, sorry. Next, we have systemic circulation. And so if you think of systemic as in systems, like all of your body systems, this is when your blood gets pumped from the left side of your heart to all of the rest of your body. Okay, and that's going to be except for the heart and the lungs, because that circulation will happen for the lungs with pulmonary circulation and for the heart with coronary circulation. So all of your other body systems and body parts will get blood supplied to them with oxygen and nutrients through systemic circulation. Okay, so this just kind of shows we don't really see specifically coronary circulation here, but here we can see on the surface of the heart some blood vessels. Okay, so they're coronary vessels, and they are going to supply the heart tissue with oxygen-rich blood, if it's going to be the red arteries that are there, and oxygen-poor blood will be taken away from the heart tissue with these coronary veins. Now, let me start with the right. So the right side of the heart is going to pump blood to the lungs. Now, your lungs aren't really above the heart like that. They would in reality be on either side of the heart. Your heart would be nestled kind of right there in between the two lungs. When your right side of your heart contracts, it sends blood to the lungs, to the right and left lung, through the pulmonary arteries. Remember that arteries carry blood away from your heart. So they're going to carry blood away from your heart to the lungs. And then pulmonary veins will return the blood from the lungs to the left side of the heart. So that's the pulmonary circuit of pulmonary circulation. When blood is in the left side of the heart and it gets pumped out of the heart itself, that's going to go into your aorta, which is your largest blood vessel. And it's going to get carried to all of your body systems where diffusion will happen. You'll have oxygen from the blood entering your tissues, carbon dioxide from the tissues entering the blood. And then that comes back to the right side of your heart, and that completes your systemic circuit of systemic circulation. Okay. In between there, so as I mentioned before, the aorta is going to be your largest blood vessel. It's going to leave the left side of your heart. Your coronary vessels actually branch off right at the base of the aorta, and that's where these would come from. Okay. So what the heart actually does in these, and we've kind of said this as we went over the diagrams before, but with systemic circulation, blood is going to flow from the left side of the heart. It's going to be pumped out of the left side of the heart to all of the tissues of the body, and then it's going to return to the right side of your heart. When it's leaving the left side of your heart, it's oxygen rich. It's got a lot of oxygen in it to get all of the tissues of your body. When it's returning to the right side of your heart, it's oxygen poor blood. At that point, when the blood is in the right side of your heart, it's ready to be pumped to your lungs so that it can pick up oxygen again. And then it's going to return back to the left side of the heart. So the heart's responsible for getting the blood where it needs to go in your body. But even though it's one heart and one organ, the right side and left side, although they'll beat at the same time, they are responsible for sending blood to different places. So with cardiac circulation, again, as I mentioned before, even though there's blood inside these chambers of the heart, and we haven't talked about what they are yet, but there are 4 chambers inside the heart if we go back to that diagram. Even though blood is inside of those chambers, it can't go into the actual muscle of the heart, that cardiac muscle, which we call myocardium. So again, the heart has its own circulatory system, essentially. It's going to have coronary arteries And again, those branch off of the aorta, and that gets oxygen-rich blood to the muscle of the heart itself. Cardiac veins will take that oxygen-poor blood away from the muscle of the heart. And then there's the coronary sinus, which is a large vein on the posterior, the back side of the heart, where the coronary or cardiac veins will empty into. And then from the coronary sinus, blood will go into the right atrium of the heart, which is the top chamber on the right side of the heart. And here we can just see some of those. So here, this would be the aorta leaving from the left side of the heart. And you've got these coronary arteries branching off from that main vessel. So that first place that oxygen-rich blood gets pumped to by the heart is, again, to the heart itself. And it does happen that way so that you can make sure your heart gets the nutrients and oxygen that it needs so that it can continue to function and pump blood where it needs to go. Now, if we look at the heart itself, again, a little bit more broad from how the heart functions, and we look at the location of the heart. The heart, as I mentioned before, is in between both lungs in an area that we call the mediastinum. And the mediastinum is just a space in your chest, in the thoracic cavity, in between the pleural sacs of the lungs. So each of your lungs is surrounded by a sac, and in between that, you've got your heart. Okay. The way the heart is oriented, the heart has a base and an apex. The base is the flattened part of the heart where the blood vessels are leaving the heart, and the apex is the pointed part. So let me go back one slide here. Where all the blood vessels are leaving up here, it's kind of flat. That's the top of the heart, which we call the base. And the pointed part down here is called the apex. Again, you would be looking at somebody else's heart and not your own in this diagram. So the base of the heart is actually kind of tilted towards your right shoulder. And then the apex, the pointed part at the bottom, would be tilted towards your left hip. So that's how it's oriented inside of your thoracic cavity. The size is about the size of your fist. Okay, so not super large of an organ, but still very important, and it does serve a very important job. Okay, if we take a look here, you can see where your heart would be. So if you say the pledge, you put your hand over your heart, you're supposed to put it over the left side of your chest, even though your heart's not actually there. Your heart is in the center, right behind the sternum or the breastbone. Your lungs would be in either side of the heart, like enclosed by the ribs there. And then we have the diaphragm right below that, which is a very large muscle, which helps with your breathing. We'll talk more about the diaphragm when we do the respiratory system, which will be the next system that we cover. Here would be kind of if we removed the ribs and you were looking at the heart. So we would have the lungs. You can see the sacs around the lungs here. They're kind of open in the front so you can see the lungs inside. So this area in between here, that is referred to as the mediastinum. Okay. You've got the heart surrounded by its own sac called the pericardium. Then you can see the blood vessels leaving the heart at the base, up at the top of the heart, and the apex down here. And then down here we can see the diaphragm, which again is a sheet of muscle responsible for helping you to breathe. If we took a cut, so if somebody was laying on their back facing upwards, and you kind of made a cut right through, like you would see on an MRI maybe, or a CAT scan, you would see this view. So here would be the vertebra, one of the backbones, and the spinal cord inside. Here you are seeing the inside of the heart, and you can see it surrounded by the lungs. And then right here, this bone would be the sternum that covers the heart. Okay, so you can see that it is actually in the center of your body. It's not on the left, even though I really don't know why we ever said that, anybody ever said that, but your heart is actually in the center of your chest, is my point there. So if we take a look, you can see there are so many blood vessels just associated with the heart itself. There are some that you're going to need to know, and we'll go over those. So some of these you won't need to know. The ones that you will need to know, we will spend time and go over. You can see right here and right here, these are the top chambers of the heart. We call those the atrium. Each one is an atrium, or plural would be atria. So right here would be the right atrium. Here would be the left atrium. Inside down here would be the right ventricle. And then over here inside would be the left ventricle. Now, the atria and ventricles are just chambers. They're essentially empty spaces, but they will be filled by the blood that is being pumped through the heart and out of the heart. There are some coverings to the heart to help protect it. So there is, as I mentioned on the previous diagram that we looked at, a couple back. Here was where I mentioned it. So you have the pericardium. It is a sac that covers the heart. And it's actually two walls that make it up. It's fibrous, meaning it's tough, and it's not like tight up against the heart. It is going to surround the heart, so we say it's superficial to the heart. And there's actually fluid inside of the pericardium, between the pericardium and the heart. Just deep to the fibrous pericardium is what we call the serous membrane, and that has two layers. We have the visceral pericardium, which is right next to the heart, and the parietal pericardium, which that is going to be the outside layer that's going to line the inner surface. So if we kind of peeled this back, this part would be the parietal pericardium, and then what actually makes up the outside of the heart, which we call the epicardium, is also called the visceral pericardium, so the inner layer of the pericardium. There is, as I mentioned, fluid in there. We call that serous fluid. And what that does is it just keeps, as the heart is pumping inside of this pericardial sac, it keeps the membrane from sticking to the heart. If we continue to look at the wall of the heart, there are three layers. Okay, we have the epicardium, which is the outer layer, the myocardium, which is the middle layer, and that's where your cardiac muscle is located, and then we have the endocardium, which is the inner layer. Let's take a look at those here. Okay, so it's not a solid object, really. Your heart is a wall with kind of these empty spaces inside, but again, there would be blood filling up those empty spaces. This pinkish part here in the middle is the myocardium. That's the middle layer. That's the cardiac muscle. Okay. On the outside of the heart here, we would have the epicardium, and that's going to be the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Here you can see the fibrous pericardium on the outside, and then this cavity in here is where that serous fluid would be that we mentioned. In here, that would be the inside of the heart. So you can see heart chamber. It's an open space inside there, and that is lined with the endocardium. Okay, so it's the inner part of the heart wall. Now, if we get into looking at the chambers of the heart, as we've mentioned before, the right and left side of the heart act as separate pumps because they're going to pump blood to different locations. So we do have 4 chambers in the heart. You have your upper chambers, or the top chambers. Those are, as plural, they're referred to as atria. Singular, you would have the right atrium and the left atrium. Okay, and then you have ventricles. You would have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So the top chambers are the receiving chambers of the heart. They're going to take blood into them from blood vessels that is either returning from the body if it's the right atrium, or from the lungs if it's the left atrium. And then the ventricles are referred to as discharging chambers because they're going to be pumping blood out of the heart to the lungs if it's from the right ventricle, or to the body if it's from the left ventricle. Okay, so here, this is our basic diagram of the heart. These parts are going to be the parts of the heart that we are going to need to know. Okay, so we have the upper chambers. Okay, so we have the right atrium, and the left atrium. Okay, I'm going to actually go through the right side of the heart first, and then we'll come back to the left side. But again, keep in mind that you are looking here at the back half really of someone else's heart. So the right of the heart is on our left as we look at the diagram, and the left of the heart is on our right as we look at the diagram. Okay. So if we are going to start with the right atrium, the way blood is going to get into the right atrium is through this blood vessel here and this blood vessel here that kind of comes behind and would empty in right in that spot. And then this blood vessel would empty in through that spot. So we have the superior vena cava. That's going to bring blood from the upper part of your body back to the heart. Here we have the inferior vena cava bringing blood from the right to the right atrium from the lower half of the body. From the right atrium, blood is going to flow through a valve. So our heart actually has 4 valves inside of it. The valve that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle, we can call that the right AV valve, right atrioventricular valve, or the actual name for it is called the tricuspid valve. The reason why it's called tricuspid, cusps are these little flaps that we see on the heart valves. Even though you can't see all 3 here, there would be 3 flaps that make up the tricuspid valve. So that's why it's a tri, is because there's 3 cusps or 3 flaps. So when the atria contract, blood is going to be pumped through that valve right there into this chamber down here, which is the right ventricle. Now you see these structures here, these little cords, those are called chordae tendineae, and they are going to be responsible for helping the valve to open and close properly. So once blood is pumped from the right atria through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, then the ventricle is going to contract. And what happens is this valve here gets forced closed. That keeps the blood from flowing backwards the way it shouldn't go. And it's going to push blood out of the ventricle into this blood vessel. This blood vessel is the pulmonary trunk. Okay. The pulmonary trunk is actually going to split into the left pulmonary artery, and that would go to the left lung over here. And it's going to curve back behind these blood vessels and become the right pulmonary artery and go to the right lung over here. Before it can get through there, it has to go through this valve, which we call the pulmonary valve or pulmonary semilunar valve. So once blood leaves through the left or the right pulmonary artery, it goes to the lungs. There's going to be that exchange of the carbon dioxide in that blood for oxygen from your lungs. And then that oxygen-rich blood is going to come from your right lung through the right pulmonary veins right here. You see that there are 2 of them. And they're coming behind these blood vessels here, so we can't really see them, but they would be emptying into this chamber right here. And then also from the left lung, which would be over here, in through these 2 left pulmonary veins. So you have 2 right pulmonary veins and 2 left pulmonary veins. So you can see through those 2 holes there, they would empty blood into the left atrium. We have a valve here separating the left atrium and the left ventricle, and that is called the left AV valve or left atrioventricular valve, or it's also called the bicuspid valve, or even the mitral valve. So there's lots of names for that particular valve. So this would be a bicuspid valve, meaning that there are 2 flaps or cusps to that particular valve, separating the left atrium and ventricle. So blood will be pumped through there, and then when the left ventricle contracts, that's going to force this valve closed, and that blood is going to go through this valve. It's kind of hard to see there, but that's called the aortic valve or the aortic semilunar valve. And then it's going to go through the aorta, which would be behind here, and you can see it coming up here. Okay, and then we have arteries starting to branch off from the aorta. Okay, the aorta curves around down behind here, so this would just kind of be running, that tube of your aorta will be running behind the heart, and that blood would continue down to the lower part of your body. And then once it travels through your body, it would come back to the right side of your heart, then to the lungs, so the left side of your heart to the body, and that process just repeats constantly. If you do see here, what we're going to talk about next is the septum of the heart, and that is right here that we see. Okay. So we actually have two septums in the heart. You have the inner ventricular septum that's going to separate the right and left ventricle, and we have the inner atrial septum to separate the two atria. Now, the purpose of both of these, if you remember that the right side of your heart has deoxygenated blood from the body on it, on that side of your heart, or in that side of your heart, really. And then the left side of your heart has oxygen-rich blood in it. The septum essentially serves as a wall to keep the oxygen-rich blood and the oxygen-poor blood from mixing. If we were to kind of make a cut across the heart this way, you can see the septum here, the interventricular septum. One thing you can also see is that the wall of the left ventricle is a lot thicker than the wall of the right ventricle. And that is because the left side of the heart has to pump blood out to the whole body. So it needs to be stronger, essentially, to pump blood a further distance. Your right ventricle is only pumping blood to the lungs, which your lungs are just right on either side of your heart. Okay, and then if we look at our valves of our heart, which we mentioned, we went over that diagram. The valves, the purpose of them is to keep blood flowing in one direction only, and to keep blood from flowing backwards inside the heart. So again, we do have 4 valves. You have 2 atrioventricular or AV valves, one between each atrium and ventricle. The bicuspid or mitral valve is on the left side of the heart between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The tricuspid valve is on the right side of the heart between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And then we have semilunar valves. Those are going to be between a ventricle and an artery leaving the heart. So the pulmonary semilunar valve is going to be between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, which branches into your pulmonary arteries, and between the left ventricle and the aorta, and that would be the aortic semilunar valve. The AV valves, or the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, are anchored in place by what we call chordae tendineae, which those are referred to as your heartstrings. Let me go back really quick so we can see their structures. So here we have, again, chordae tendineae. You can see them here as well as here. Okay, they're attached to these little muscles that stick out here. We call those papillary muscles, but that's not labeled on the diagram. The chordae tendineae are actually fairly tough, and when we do our virtual heart dissection, you'll be able to kind of, I'll say, hear how strong they are, which doesn't really make sense now, but it'll make sense when we do that later. So those valves are open when the heart muscle is relaxed, and they're closed when the ventricles are contracting. So that pressure of the ventricles contracting forces those valves closed. The semilunar valves are closed when the heart is relaxed, but open when the ventricles are contracting. So if you notice that, they operate in opposite of each other, and that forces the blood to flow in one direction only. Okay, we're going to stop after this diagram here. So this is just to point out where our valves are. Again, so you see between the right atrium and the right ventricle, we have this valve right here, the tricuspid valve. Then that blood would go from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk and then the pulmonary arteries through the pulmonary valve. When blood returns to the left side of the heart from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, it goes into the left atrium, and then it goes through the mitral valve. That's also called the bicuspid valve that you see right here. And then from the left ventricle, the blood is pumped through the aortic valve into the aorta, and then leaves the heart and goes to the rest of the body. Okay. So we are going to stop with the notes there, and we will pick up with the rest of the notes in our next class.